So I hope you enjoyed the intro. So my family is actually from Dubai. They moved to the creek when it was literally a creek in 1974. There we go. The clicker is working. We are now good to go. So my name is Mathew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute and the World Futures Forum. I'm a futurist and strategic advisor to all G20 governments around the world, including the UAE government and other Middle Eastern governments as well. I work with the vast majority of multinationals, both across the finance space, but across other sectors as well. And you are using products from a lot of these companies today. So my point of view is the next 50 years. So in the UAE's case, we go up to 1971, or 2071 rather, with organizations like the Dubai Futures Foundation, Area 2071, the Bin Rashid Al Maktoum Innovation Centers, and so on and so forth. And when we start having a look at the next 50 years, we can predict the near future, which I know is sort of difficult basically from a finance perspective. When it gets to further out, everything becomes really quite fuzzy. And the broader you go, the fuzzier it naturally gets, because we already live in science fiction times. Now, this is sort of one statement that I think bears true, irrespective of where you are in the world. How you view the world changes everything. If you see the future basically as a negative place, basically you are going to be protectionist. If you see it as an opportunistic place, you are going to take risks. And we saw this in the US elections as well. Now, when we actually have a look at innovation, so for example, in 2023, the UAE is going to be hosting the COP28, and we've just seen COP26, obviously. On the one hand, from the UAE's perspective, you're going to have a lot of protesters. On the second hand, you actually have a huge amount of opportunity ahead of you, because when we start talking about tackling some of the world's largest crises, and according to the United Nations, there are at least 16 different categories if you look at the UN SDGs. So what we need today is we need innovators, and I'm going to start proving how we actually manage to solve a lot of the world's challenges. We have innovators. We have solutions to every single one of the world's problems right here, right now, and I'm going to show you those, just to prove it. Governments, increasingly governments are actually optional. While they can bring in new regulations such as the banning of internal combustion engines from 2030, which then affect different markets and so on and so forth, the European Big Green Deal that deprioritizes oil and gas, et cetera, increasingly governments are optional. And we do increasingly believe that private sector has more ability than ever before to make an impact on the world stage that is bigger and more impactful than anything governments can achieve. If you think about Google, for example, they developed the first fully autonomous vehicles. Elon Musk, basically with Tesla, arguably kick-started the electric vehicle race, and so on and so forth. We also need businesses, because we create new things to solve old problems. The governments create policies and regulations to do whatever they do. But then if we want to change, for example, climate change, if we want to tackle climate change very, very quickly, we need businesses who can do that, typically multinational businesses, and I'm going to give you a dilemma here. And in the middle, you need money. So we all need to work together, as I said in COP26, to solve some of the world's greatest challenges. And as we start talking about entering the new normal, even before COVID, there wasn't any normal, because the speed of disruption has accelerated so much that every industry on every continent, every part of global business, culture, and society has been thoroughly disrupted at faster speeds than ever before. There isn't really anything such as normal any longer, and in the investment community, you'll know that, because you will see stocks bouncing up and down and all kinds of different things. But similarly, crisis revolutionizes society. So for example, getting the clicker to work, in the 1300s, Europe was hit by the Black Plague. It affected over 80% of the entire population. crises typically bring out the best in people, but also kickstart a change. So in the 1300s, a lot of people who were trying to avoid the Black Plague got on ships and went exploring. It's also believed because there weren't very many scribes around, that's why the printing press was invented. Fast forward to 1918, and on the one hand, we'd just come out of the First World War, we went straight into a pandemic. And in this particular case, we still had people who didn't like wearing masks, but women ended up working in factories, so we saw quite a significant change in gender relations. But we also saw a massive uptick in the number of startups. Now, when we have a look at the pandemic that we are still going through today, it's done quite a number of things. On the one hand, it's accelerated digital transformation. So, to quote Accenture, Microsoft, and those types of organizations, the vast majority of organizations who would normally take 5 to 7 years to digitize their front office and their back office have typically done it in 3 to 6 months. So we've seen a massive acceleration of digitization. Bearing in mind, digitization breaks down the boundaries between each individual business. It makes it very easy for you to become a multi-sided platform business. And multi-sided platform businesses in today's day and age outperformed everyone else by 350%. So the leaders accelerated, they're accelerated, and the laggards, they got worse from a stocks and shares and investment perspective. When we look at forced adoption, everyone was forced to work from home. Businesses were suddenly forced to shut shops. And again, when you go and have conversations, especially with CEOs, CFOs, or whatever it happens to be, they achieved things that they could never dream of achieving. So for example, over in Bahrain, in 3 days, they set up a hospital at the airport. They couldn't have done that, even by their government's own admission, in 5 years. And then forced innovation. Institutions and organizations that suddenly found their revenues being impacted, all of a sudden had to find new ways to do new things. So then we saw the rise of this trend, creative destruction. And on the one hand, creative destruction comes as part of the S&P, because in 1968, the typical life of an S&P organization was 61 years. Now it's around 15. I can show you how we can disrupt an entire global industry much, much faster than that with examples. So, COVID did this. It changed everyone's perception of the art of the possible. Technology also did the same. As an example, it would normally take 5 to 10 years to create a vaccine for something like COVID. Using artificial intelligence, supercomputing, genomics, and other exponential technologies, we achieved it in 3 months. It took 6 months to do the human trials. But from a healthcare perspective, we are now creating human digital twins that we can actually test new drugs on, which means that we could actually get the human trial process ultimately down to about a week. Everything gets faster. Now, for our own pandemic, we saw Build Back Better. Now, Build Back Better typically comes out in things like ESG, European Green Deals, the Build Back Better initiative in the UK, going green and sustainable, creating this kind of new future. But we also saw a startup boom. We saw an 85% increase in the number of global new business registrations. Does that sound familiar? This is a repetition, almost, of 100 years ago, and kind of a repetition of almost 700 years ago, when crisis hit society. I'm trying to find where the clicker goes. There we go. So when we have a look at the speed of change, moving up there, consider this. When we sort of look at the television, you'll all have seen this kind of graph. To hit 50 million users, it used to take 75 years. Pokemon Go, basically when Pokemon Go came out, it hit 50 million users basically within 16 days. Call of Duty hit 100 million users in 6 days. Which then begs the question, if you look at this graph and you have a natural continuation, at what point do we disrupt something? maybe a global industry like the global financial services industry within one day. And if you think that's impossible, we have 3.5 billion people on the planet connected today. We have another 3.5 to 4 billion people coming online with space internet systems. We have an increasingly digital and connected society. So Facebook and Libra could have disrupted global banking and the state's control of money by the admission of the chairman of the People's Bank of China, the ECB, the Bank of England, and the US Fed in one day. Because Mark Zuckerberg, had the regulators allowed it, and that's the key, had the regulators allowed Libra to go live, Mark Zuckerberg could have pushed the button, and technically he could have had 3.2 billion people using it on day one. He could easily have had 100 to 200, maybe even 500 million people using it at day one. That changes the money markets. Facebook would have been the 6th largest country. They would have been able to have an impact on foreign exchange rates because Libra was a basket of currencies. So now, change is more powerful and impactful, and it's also more science fiction. So when you have a look at your own sector, the technologies I list here, I follow over 450 exponential technologies. This particular chart is my starburst. It goes from 2020 to 2071. There are 178 exponential technologies on here. Each one of these technologies is worth about $500 billion from an addressable market opportunity perspective. Each one of these technologies can either destroy an industry, disrupt an industry, or, in the case of general purpose technologies like artificial intelligence, can disrupt all of them. So for example, and I'm not really going to go around this at too length, number 2, advanced manufacturing up there, 3D printing. 3D printing fundamentally disrupts the $10 trillion manufacturing industry, also disrupts the construction industry. In addition to that, bioreactors. No one really knows about bioreactors. Bioreactors disrupt the global agricultural industry as well as global supply chains. As I say, I'm not going to go through all of these by any stretch. Connectivity. 5G fundamentally disrupts the markets. 5G's got an estimated market opportunity of about $12 trillion. Quantum computing, for example, changes how you do your risk matrices. Quantum computing, artificial intelligence, fundamentally changes your own industry at scale, at amazing speed. And we sort of go around all this, but we've got new revelations coming in absolutely every sector. When you combine all of these different technologies together, I can either destroy all of the value in your portfolios, or I can create new value. Hence some of the funds, basically, that we actually see. I'm not sure what's up with the clicker, sorry. God, blimey. We'll get there with the clicker. So maybe if I stand over here. Every industry is being disrupted. So when you have a look at your own portfolios, every single industry that you have a position in is being disrupted. Global food industry, I'm going to be talking about that in a bit. Oh my God. The energy industry, we have over 2.5 trillion watts of renewables installed, and last year we had 250 gigawatts of new energy from renewables installed. Comparing that to fossil fuels, which make up most people's investment portfolio, fossil fuels had an installation of about 60 gigawatts, and that's been declining. When we actually have a look at the financial services sector, basically we've got artificial intelligence, quantum technology and communications, basically we've got robo-advisors coming through. We also have fintechs, basically in decentralized finance. When we have a look at healthcare, I have the healthcare technologies now basically to put you onto an intravenous drip if you have an inherited genetic disease. I give you a cup of tea, you sit in a hospital bed for half an hour, a technology called CRISPR goes into your body, clips out the bad gene, clips in a good gene. You no longer have the inherited genetic condition that you were born with. That one technology solves over 6,000 inherited genetic conditions that today are uncurable. And that's before we get to some of the other things. And then when we have a look at the transportation sector sector is exactly the same. Everything is going fully autonomous, everything is going electric. And then there's conversations about battery electric vehicles versus fuel cell and hydrogen electric vehicles. But we're also disrupting the construction industry. And this is happening in Dubai with 25% of the residential industry. So that one technology does a number of things. On the one hand, it means you're going to be 3D printing the Dubai Mars City, which is a couple of miles up the road. Secondly, Dubai basically is going to have over 25% of new residential homes are going to be 3D printed by 2030. Thirdly, from a property portfolio perspective, especially in the residential sector, if any of you are actually exposed to residential property portfolios, that can erase over half their value. We've seen that already happen in the US, because the cost of 3D printing a building is 90% less than building a building in a regular way. It's also 95% faster. And it's a manufacturing process that you can automate. So property portfolios are already starting to take hits, but residential, not commercial. I really don't know what's going on with the clicker. So 2028. So 2028 basically is an interesting year, because when you have conversations with biotech organizations around the world, they believe that 2028 is the point at which we reach something called escape velocity. Escape velocity is when new medical breakthroughs can add more than a year's worth of life to your life for every year that you have lived. Which then means we are now on the upward cusp to realizing centennials as being the average life expectancy outside of COVID, and we can push to 125. Now, from a pensions portfolio, from an assets portfolio, if you look at the global asset managers, from a savings and investment perspective, from a private wealth office perspective, this changes everything. It changes how we save. It changes how you plan your estates. If you are a high net worth individual and you are looking to live to 125, bearing in mind Jeff Bezos has the Altus Institute, which is trying to do exactly that. You have Mark Zuckerberg with the Chen Institute, who are literally trying to get rid of disease. If you live to 125, the way that you plan your investments and your portfolios fundamentally changes. Do you now care about a warming planet because it's more than likely that in 2050 you'll start seeing the consequences? In addition to that, when we have a look at some of the other healthcare technologies, you're replaceable. So your parents might have actually said that you aren't replaceable. But fortunately, you are replaceable. Today, we can replace 70% of the human body. The brain is still mission critical, but we can 3D print human organs. In Israel, we've 3D printed a human heart. So if you have a heart attack in 10 years' time, we take stem cells from you, 3D print a new heart, and this heart that they printed in Israel actually works. We implant that into you, you leave the same day. We can already have 3D print a variety of different organs as well. So you are increasingly replaceable, a little bit like a car. If parts of your body fail, you go to hospital and you get those replaced. You know, today we do that with hips and bones and everything else, but increasingly we can do it with livers, kidneys, skin, muscle tissue, cartilage. We're also able, right now, to create humans that are resistant and immune from every single known pathogen on Earth. This was carried out illegally in China using a CRISPR technology. So gene editing is an incredibly powerful technology, and actually disrupts more than the healthcare industry. You can disrupt the energy industry with it as well. And in addition to that, as I've explained better with in vivo gene editing, we can redesign you. So while these are still going through regulation, this is the stuff that from a portfolio perspective, an opportunity portfolio, when we talk about the future of healthcare and healthcare investments, that you start thinking about. Ethical capitalism. So when I go around the world, and we've seen lots of these different kinds of surveys, younger generations especially believe that capitalism as we see it today is broken. Depending on the country, it's 54 to 94% of young people think that capitalism as we see it today is fundamentally broken. Because when you actually have a look at what capitalism has done for us, we treat workers as commodities. We pull everything out of the ground, basically, so then we start creating all these sort of other environmental problems that we actually see. Younger generations increasingly want to embrace what we call ethical capitalism. But what is ethical capitalism? So ethical capitalism is where we move from an organizational-centric view, or an organization-centric view, to a purpose-centric view. And what does that actually mean? Well, it has implications for the UAE. So in 2071, the UAE wants to be the happiest place on earth. If you still have traditional capitalism, there's going to be people who win. There are going to be people that lose. So when we talk about ethical capitalism, we talk about for every dollar that you spend or invest, it should have an impact on the organization's financial well-being, naturally. But it should also have an impact, a positive impact, on people, nature, and what we call social capital. So this is the economics, if you've ever heard of it, this is the economics of mutuality. So we actually have a way to profitably move from traditional capitalism to ethical capitalism. Bearing in mind they've got COP28 coming as well, this is a good message to have. Now, when we have a look at ESG and impact investing, do we want to build a sustainable future, or do we want to build a regenerative future? Because to quote Greta Thunberg, our house is already on fire. So what we're really looking to do today is we're simply looking to put the house fire out. But when we do that by 2050, we just have a burnt-out house. It's not on fire any longer, but we have a burnt-out house. So are we looking to build a sustainable society or a regenerative society? There is a huge difference in approaches. At the moment, when we have a look at ESG assets under management, it's about 34 trillion. By 2025, we estimate that's going to be about $50 trillion, and that's going to represent around 35% of all assets under management. Furthermore, when we actually have a look at the cost of trying to get to net zero, it's estimated that we need to spend $92 trillion getting to net zero. At the moment, we're investing about $1.7 trillion. We actually have a gap of about 3-ish, 3, 4, depending whose sort of stats you take. We actually have a gap of about $3 to $4 trillion at the minute, which means basically that from a United Nations perspective, we're off track. And that was highlighted at COP. So why does sustainability matter? And when we talk about sustainability, we're not just talking about investing to make an impact on UN SDG 13. We're talking about making a positive impact on people and planet. It's, again, a different type of investment ethos. It's because people matter, and it's because the Earth is mission critical. So sometimes people ask me where my focus is. I typically say my focus is on both people and planet, but really planet first, because if you have an uninhabitable planet, there are no people. And if you sort of fast forward, say, to the year 2041 with Dubai, as we see rising temperatures, Dubai as a city is going to be a massive heat sink. So while climate change isn't necessarily affecting Dubai too much at the moment, it's going to be heat that you're not going to like and you already don't like some of the heat. At the moment, from a societal level, we consume over 100 billion tons of resources on an annual basis, but we only recycle 8.6%. That's unsustainable. In addition to that, we have loads of problems. But I'm going to show you solutions as well. Problems, everyone knows are problems. For a start, by 2030, we are going to need 35% more food, 40% more water, 50% more energy. So it's not just a case of investing to build out new energy capacity, new food capacities, or whatever it happens to be. We need to do something fundamentally disruptive. And those figures are in spite of this. Biodiversity has collapsed by 20% over the past century. Extreme weather, in the past 20 years, we have seen a 600% increase in extreme weather events. It's cost 1.2 million lives, caused 4.2 billion people to be affected in different ways, and it's caused $2.93 trillion worth of damage by the insurers' own statistics. Ocean acidification. Oceans are 30% more acidic today than they were 20 years ago. That affects 75% of all marine life. So we have a growing middle class that needs more protein, which means they need more fish and other meats. But at the same time, the oceans aren't doing very well. And then when we have a look at resource scarcity, we've got a lot of materials that run out over the next 100 years, even wood, even land, even though we're building land. But fish, land, lithium. We actually have a way to mine lithium from the ocean profitably now in Saudi Arabia. Sea level rise. Sea levels are rising at about 8 millimeters per year. That affects over 570 cities and affects 1 billion people. Water stress. By the United Nations' own statistics, they estimate that 129 countries will be in a state of water stress by 2030. Water stress is determined by this. Can you grow crops or not? So 129 countries are going to have problems with water stress. In California, 85% of California is in extreme drought. That's not only affected their ability to grow food and produce, their hydroelectric dams are no longer generating electricity. The Hoover Dam is 1 meter away, basically, from shutting down. I said I'd talk about solutions. Talking about problems is easy. And this is where you guys come in from an investment perspective. So energy. We are literally in the middle of an energy revolution. I was up at ADIPEC, up at the ADNEC conference a couple of days ago. Everyone's switching to renewables and hydrogen, which I weren't even having those conversations 5 years ago. But when we actually have a look at the future energy matrix, we've got carbon capture. Those are increasingly getting cheaper. Wireless energy transmission, structural batteries, nuclear will form part of the future mix. So we have mini nuclear reactors. So really the future mix is hydrogen, renewables, and nuclear. We can already 3D print lithium-ion batteries to create batteries that are 400% more energy dense than anything in an electric vehicle. So when we talk about energy solutions, all these are big topics in themselves, we have lots of solutions. In addition to that, solar power generation is the cheapest form of electricity now in over 60 countries. It also accounts with wind for 80% of all new energy installations. The big numbers, 17 and 20, we already have solar panels that are 20% energy efficient. At that point, the International Energy Administration say that we now have solar is now the cheapest form of electricity generation in history. We're generating at about $20 per megawatt hour. Fossil fuels cannot come back from that. We're getting cheaper than coal. In fact, we are cheaper than coal. However, that's what we can do with a solar panel that's 20% energy efficient. We have a pathway to 132%. And these are prototyped. We already have 48%. Because we go from silicon solar panels to Perscovite to bacteria to silicon solar panels that can reclaim heat, and then the 132% number That's black silicon. So we use 3D printing to create a nanophotonic material that catches all the small wavelengths of light to create black silicon. 132%. The energy mix is changing at a fundamental level. But I'm going to give you a dilemma. When you start having conversations with your own clients, basically, how many of your clients basically are saying, we want to get out of oil and gas? And as a portfolio, basically, most of you are probably dumping oil and gas as well. But at the start, I said, what we have is we have solutions. And provided we have money, you then need people to build wind farms. So as an industry, your dilemma is this. If we want to make Greta Thunberg happy, and we want to move from an old energy economy to a new energy economy as quickly as possible, do you go and ask the one-man band to build your giant wind farm, or do you go and ask ADNOC or BP? That's a real dilemma. And when you actually have a look at investment based in the oil and gas sector, or oil and gas companies, it's fallen from $750 billion in 2014 to about $250 billion in 2019. So actually disinvesting, basically in some of these large companies who are trying to transition themselves, actually hobbles our own efforts to solve climate change. That's a real dilemma. Can you imagine going to any of your clients and saying, so what we've done is we've actually just put a portfolio forward for ADNOC. They'll go, what are you doing that for? Haven't you heard of this thing called climate change? Food. So vertical farms. We've got vertical farms in Masdar, basically up the Sheikh Zayed Road as well. This one technology basically turns the UAE from a net food importer to an exporter, as well as creating self-sufficiency. We can take a space like this, we can put racks of lettuces, tier 3 crops and everything else, and we can grow them cheaper than you can find in a conventional supermarket. We can also eliminate over 95% of the environmental impact of traditional farming, because we can use hydro panels on the roof, which are solar panels that generate water from rainwater, water from the atmosphere. So we eliminate agriculture's need for potable water. Bearing in mind that trying to solve water is an issue, because agriculture uses 70% of the world's fresh water, more than us. But then we can grow crops in an organic way with 8 times the yield, also with no herbicides or pesticides, so we don't get any negative runoff. These companies are seeing billions of dollars of investment. But this starts solving some of the climate change problems that we see associated with agriculture. We then also have cellular agriculture. There we go. So cellular agriculture, at a really high level, I take the cell from one animal, put it into a bioreactor that I mentioned earlier, I now have meat without the animal. So I'm going to introduce you to, just to prove we have solutions, I'm going to show you Ian the chicken.
We've all been there, right? In the grocery store. Oh, I'll just buy this meat. And there it is. And all we have to do is buy it. We don't have to think about what it took to make that chicken in that nice packaging. But the reality of the way that it came about, it's incredibly unsustainable. And that's one of the biggest problems facing humanity right now. But we figured out a way to solve it. The whole idea is that that chicken in itself has an unlimited source of itself, and there is a way where you can take just a handful of cells and keep growing them essentially infinitely. For those very first cells, it was important to us how we got the cells, not just that we got the cells. We came up with the idea to use one feather from the single best chicken that we could find.
We picked out.
first thing we need to do is we need to identify a cell that we are going to use as the basic starter material. And then what we need to do is find a food for it to grow in. So we have to identify the right set of nutrients that will cause the cells to multiply, but not just multiply, but do so quickly and into high densities.
Wake up, I wanna lift you up, I wanna dress you up, let's be friends.
It was an out-of-body experience to sit there and eat a chicken, but have the chicken that you're eating running around in front of you. You don't imagine doing something like that.
We have the technology to solve a whole variety of different global problems. Water, what about solving water? 3D printing. So 3D printed heat exchangers, we can extract 400 liters of water directly out of the air. Whether it's here, we can do about 3 liters out of a desert environment like the Sahara. Now, as for banking, though, when we have a look at kind of traditional banking, it's always about your customers. But when we actually have a look at banking, I consider banking a little bit broken because I'm a banking customer. And what I mean by that is banks take my money, give me literally no return, and then farm that money out and loan that money out basically to other organizations to do whatever they want to. Now, part of this isn't necessarily the financial services industry's fault. It's kind of the Medici's fault. So in 1397, the Medici Bank was created. And Medici thought, well, what if we take everyone's money and we put it into a safe place? And then at some point, about 5 years later, said, well, why don't we loan this money out? And that's what the financial services industry has been doing ever since. We saw Bank 2 with mainframe era. And then we saw self-service coming through with Bank 3. When we have a look at Bank 4 is increasingly automated. It's autonomous, and we already have fully autonomous hedge funds, for example, slightly different, out of Wall Street as well as Hong Kong. It's digital, frictionless, it's hyper-personal, and it's hybrid. So the future bank is a multi-sided platform that you can just plug different things into. It knows you at a very personal level. It has a huge amount of not just automation. Automation is dumb. Autonomous systems are smart. They're capable of making proactive decisions like deep learning. And then when we actually start looking at fintechs, 73, this is sort of where we're coming from a millennials perspective. 73% of millennials would try financial services from Apple, Google, Nike. This is an HSBC survey as well. 71% of millennials would rather go to the dentist than talk to their bank. 50% don't see themselves staying with the current bank. 18% of them have actually switched to say, we don't want to bank with you, we have moved. Venmo became a verb in 2016. 57% basically people don't want their data to be stolen, and 56% worry that bank accounts and cards will be compromised. But 14% of people would trust a robot surgeon to do open heart surgery. Only 11% would trust a robo-advisor. So the kind of rule from this is, even though fintech's basically doing some things right, there's still a long way to go before they can ultimately automate the entire stack, which is what they're trying to do. Now, when we start having a look at incumbents, they still have a broken business model, or we have a fintechs, they still have a broken business model, but what they do have is a great UI. Now, during COVID, when we start having a look at consumer trends, of all of the new bank accounts that were opened across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, 64% were with a fintech. The cost of operating, the cost of opening those accounts for a fintech basically was pretty much zero in the red. And the cost of 1 year's worth of management for those accounts was $25 for a fintech. But from a traditional bank's perspective, what's the most interesting number is the red 71%. Because of all of the accounts that were opened, only 29% of people put more than $100 into a fintech. 71% of people put more than $100 into a traditional bank, which kind of comes down to capitalizations. So fintechs have got this. They have really nice user interfaces, seamless customer experiences. They lack scale. The lack of capitalization actually hurt them during COVID. Increasingly, they can access global banking with just 5 lines of API code. We're also in the UK seeing the rise of fully autonomous regulators. So the FCA are actually digitizing the rule books and then using machine vision and using blockchain on rails to create fully autonomous regulators for fintechs, by the way, not traditional banks. But when we have a look at incumbents, incumbent banks have got people's trust. The reason we know that is because they put more money into traditional banks than they did the fintechs. But the fintechs had a nicer UI and it was easier to actually interact. So from a bank's perspective, yeah, fintechs basically are artificial intelligence, they're automated, they're cloud, DevOps, and digital by design. Incumbents, analog, legacy, manual, big mainframes in the data center kind of thing. But banks are learning. And some of the new tricks that they're doing is they're starting to take parts of the fintech playbook. So now we have banks like JP Morgan saying it's too hard to transition and transform our traditional bank. But we like the future, consumers kind of like the new fintech feel, so we're going to do this. We're going to create a new digital bank. So what JP Morgan do is they transform the core, and they spend $15 billion a year on that. They build a brand new bank from scratch, which is a digital bank with all the things that people like, and then that buys them time to complete their core transition. So there's ways to sidestep disruption. This is Cora. Cora basically is a digital human that is being used by NatWest to manage account inquiries, loans, mortgages, travel information. She is an animated digital human that is incredibly lifelike, and she has a neural network brain. And then when we have a look at JP Morgan again, we see the automation of law. So JP Morgan have used robo-lawyers, which are artificial intelligent robo-lawyers, to save over 465,000 man-hours of work. So banks are actually learning from fintechs. That's fintech's superpower. But then when we have a look at DeFi, we've got central bank digital currencies. So China are sort of racing ahead here. When we have a look at CBDCs, CBDCs allow us to do something quite interesting. They allow the central government or the central bank to monitor every part of an economy at the granular level in real time. So for example, if we can see that in Dubai Mall, nobody is actually buying coffee because we see all the transactions on the blockchains, we could send, as a government, we could send out an SMS alert saying, if you are in Dubai Mall, you can buy coffee tax-free today, or we will give you a tax break somewhere else, today only. So CBDCs are a really good way to stimulate different parts of your economy in real time. And then when we have a look at crypto, obviously we're seeing a lot of disintermediation, and we're seeing a lot of real-time economies basically coming through from that. However, have you ever thought basically of who your future competitors are? Because as banks, wealth management offices, whatever it happens to be, I guarantee you're looking at fintechs. How many of you have ever looked at Epic or Fortnite as a future competitor? This is almost the perfect decentralized finance platform in the making. 95% of their revenue comes from microtransactions. They have over 350 million users. They already do microfinance. They've even got Fortnite coins. And they're also allowing people to buy and sell NFT assets. Do I want to invest in a traditional property portfolio when I could invest in an NFT portfolio? This also gives regulators kittens because this is fundamentally new. And then when we actually come back to kind of Libra, because Libra, Facebook's cryptocurrency, became DM. It'll get there eventually. Here we go. So when we actually have a look at Facebook or Meta building the metaverse, exactly the same thing. Meta could put DM into the heart of Facebook with 3.2 billion users. They could deliver different types of microfinance, different types of finance, different types of investment options. And they're also building a massive NFT marketplace. So, sort of bringing this full circle, originally I said everything was about the customer, right? I give my money to my bank gives it to other people and loans it out at a high rate, and on the interest that I gain, I have no idea how they did that. There's no transparency. In fact, one of the banks basically I use actually ended up financing Iran a little while ago, which is naughty of them. So when we start talking about the art of the possible, as an individual consumer, why don't I do this? Why don't I become the investor? Technology decentralizes all manner of different services. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, no, you don't want to become an investor because you aren't a professional. We are the professionals. We look at the markets. We analyze the risks. And then we come up basically with a strategy for you. But this is a customer-first strategy. Using decentralized finance platforms, I'm in control. Even if I'm not the right person to be in control. That's a matter for the regulators and an education matter. I might be absolutely rubbish at investing. But nevertheless, I'm in control. I can choose what I invest in. In addition to that, I can choose who I lend my own money to on a peer-to-peer system. These systems are also increasingly fully autonomous because AI is my future co-pilot. And when you have a look at the quantitative trading piece, artificial intelligence generated returns in the alternative finance sector of 64%. It smashed human traders. And that's before we talk about RBS making all of its wealth management advisors redundant because their own artificial intelligence was creating bigger returns and cost a lot less money. And also, I have social finance as well. So I can see, so a little bit like Robin Hood. And that has caused the SEC no manner of problems because they didn't see it coming. So we're increasingly in the wild, wild west. But if I take decentralized finance, is decentralized finance Bank 5? And what happens from my perspective is, why don't I just do this? I want to put my money in a safe place. That's what I do with a traditional bank today. So I give all my money to Nike or Apple or Google because they have huge balance sheets. They're able to cover the liabilities. So I give Nike all my money. Nike is my bank account. They have hooks into decentralized finance. So via a Nike platform, I can do all sorts of different things. I can figure out what I could invest in because I have a robo advisor. Or I have a human advisor. We could plug them in as well. And from my perspective, I want to save the planet. Because the investments that I have with my banks, I have no idea what they're doing with my money. I want to save the sloth. And Save the Sloth campaigns are on decentralized finance platforms. So I choose to take 100 of my dollars, or if I'm an HNW, 10 million of my dollars, and invest it in saving the sloth. And I can get updates and everything else on how sloths are doing. I can't do that with any traditional incumbent bank or fintech today. And then, it kind of then brings us to this. I need a new clicker. Do you like the picture of the sloth? Is up there for a while. So in summary, when we actually have a look at a world in transition, I said everything was about the customer. But when it comes to saving the planet, people and planet, I've shown you solutions for energy, food, and water. I have solutions for the rest. Technically, we could use decentralized finance to help resolve poverty to different degrees, which then means that we have the technology. we have businesses. And what we now need in the middle is finance, which then means that realistically, this entire presentation is actually about you. So thank you very much. Thank you for putting up with the clicker and me. And it's been very nice to be here. Thank you very much. So I'm not sure if they're going to questions. But do you have any questions? I also don't know if there are any runners, basically, for the microphones. Oh, there we go. So does anyone have a question? Or are you too busy thinking about the sloth? It's bright, so I can't see. No? Well, it's been lovely being here. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the day. Take care.